Seamstress turned cook, arrived at the frontier, seeking work, but faced a harsh cowboy. Next door, the frontier lay in silence, the kind of silence that came after wind had run itself empty across the plains. Dust clung to the horizon, pale and dry, and the wooden cabins that lined the road seemed more like forgotten bones than homes. A wagon wheel creaked in the distance, and the sound carried sharp and hollow, like it had no business breaking such stillness. Morning had come, though the sun gave no warmth. Only a thin gold stretched across the land like a warning. She stepped down from the wagon carefully, skirts gathered in her hands so they would not catch the splintered edges of the step. Her shoes were worn thin, more suited for narrow city alleys than open dirt roads. She carried little with her, only a bundle of cloth tied with string and a rolled apron that smelled faintly of flour and smoke. Her name was Clara, though no one here knew it yet. To these strangers, she was only another traveler come to this quiet edge of the frontier, searching for a place to stand still after too much moving. The house she had been promised stood small and grey, tucked against a slope where the ground leaned into the beginning of hills. It was not much, but to Clara it was something solid after years of drift and sewing rooms that paid pennies for bloodied fingers. She pressed her hand against the doorframe as though it might steady her, though what waited inside was nothing more than a plain table, a stove, and walls too thin to hold warmth. From across the yard came the sound of boots on dry ground, heavy, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who did not care to soften his steps. Clara looked up, squinting into the low light, and saw him. A tall figure, weathered by sun and solitude, shoulders broad beneath a coat that had seen more storms than care. His eyes caught hers only. Eye briefly, flat and unreadable, before sliding past her like she was no more than dust caught in the wind. He stopped at the edge of his fence, leaning one arm across the post as though measuring her. Nothing was said, but the quiet between them grew heavy. She tightened her grip on her bundle, sensing that this land did not welcome easily, and neither did the man who lived next door. Clara spent her first hours in the small cabin dusting surfaces that had not seen touch in years. The stove coughed when she tried to coax a flame from its belly, and the walls carried the sharp smell of old smoke. Her hands shook as she laid out her few belongings, a habit born from hunger and constant moving, as if order alone could shield her from despair. She did not speak, not even to herself, and the silence pressed closer with every minute she tried to fill with chores. Through the thin window she could see him again, the cowboy from next door, bending to fasten a gate latch. His movements were sharp, his jaw set tight. He carried himself like a man who had grown used to shutting out the world before it could reach him. Clara recognized it, though she wished she didn't. There was a way the shoulders held tension, a way the eyes avoided lingering, that reminded her of the men who had passed through the sewing shops, men broken by the war, men who sought quiet but never found it. She had promised herself never to look too closely at such faces again, and yet here she was, staring. Later that evening, when the air had turned colder and the land darkened, Clara stepped outside with a bucket to fetch water. The handle bit into her palm as she walked, and when she reached the well, she saw him there, already drawing rope. He did not speak. His presence was an unbroken wall, but something in her, the exhaustion, the hunger, the loneliness, broke through her silence. She shifted the bucket and her hands and lowered her eyes, unsure whether to ask for help or to pretend she was strong enough to do it alone. He looked at her then, a long and unkind look, but beneath it was something else. He saw the tremble in her hands, the stiffness in her shoulders, and for an instant it was not Clara at the well but a shadow of someone from his own past. A younger woman, frail and pale, standing in a doorway too heavy for her frame. He shook the memory off, but it clung. He had buried enough faces, lost enough chances to step forward, and the guilt was something he carried like a stone in his chest. The dilemma cut him open in silence. He could keep his distance as he always had, let the stranger woman bear her own weight, and in doing so remain safe inside his solitude. Or he could reach out, knowing well that once he did, the line he had drawn for years would vanish. To help meant responsibility, and responsibility meant pain. The night deepened. Clara fumbled with the rope, the water sloshing, her hands raw. His jaw worked, the choice burning through him. Finally, with a sigh that felt like defeat and mercy both, he stepped forward, took the rope from her hands, and filled her bucket. He said nothing, only set the water at her feet. But in that quiet act, he had already chosen. He would not let her carry the weight alone. The days passed in uneven silence. Clara settled into the cabin as best she could, stitching curtains from scraps of fabric and trading small loaves of bread with townsfolk for flour. She spoke little, though sometimes a faint hum escaped her while she kneaded dough, a habit carried from the sewing rooms where women sang under their breath to mask the sound of needles pricking skin. The cowboy next door, whose name she overheard once in town as Elias, remained watchful but distant, always hovering like a shadow that refused to leave. He never asked why she had come, but questions lived in his eyes every time he saw her struggling to haul water or chop wood. The answer arrived before he ever dared to voice it. One late afternoon, 2 riders Apache. Their lives, separate until now, were tied by the same storm. The riders returned to town after their first visit, but the air never loosened again. Clara kept her doors bolted at night, listening for hoofbeats in the dark, while Elias sat long hours by his fence with a lantern burning low, eyes fixed on the road. Their words to each other remained few, yet a silent understanding grew between them. They were bound now by a threat neither had chosen, and that bond spoke louder than conversation ever could. One morning, Elias brought an old rifle to Clara's porch. He placed it against the wall without ceremony, his voice low as gravel. "You'll need to know," he said simply, then walked her into the field behind her cabin. Clara's hands trembled when she held the weapon, its weight foreign to someone who had carried only needles and spools. Elias stood behind her, adjusting her grip, steadying her shoulders. His touch was brief, almost reluctant, but it carried more care than any words might. The shot cracked across the plains, echoing into silence, and Clara lowered the gun with wide eyes. Elias nodded once, not in praise, but in recognition of her courage. Evenings brought another kind of quiet. Clara began cooking extra portions and leaving a plate at Elias's fence. He never asked, never thanked, only collected it at dusk and returned the tin by morning. But once, when she found it washed clean, she understood it as gratitude, rough and wordless. Slowly, these gestures stitched them closer. Her bread, his rifle, 2 lives circling in the fragile rhythm of trust. One night, as firelight flickered against the cabin walls, Clara set aside her mending and rolled her sleeve up past her wrist. Scars ran pale across her forearm, thin and raised like cruel threads left behind. She did not speak of them, but her eyes did, and Elias, sitting across from her, lowered his gaze to his own hands. He unbuttoned his cuff, revealing a jagged mark near his elbow, a wound that had never healed right. For a moment, their silence deepened, heavy with the weight of unspoken histories. Her years bent over machines that stole her youth, his years under a sky filled with gunfire and orders that left him hollow. No promises were made, no declarations spoken. Instead, Clara poured coffee into 2 cups, sliding one across the table. Elias accepted, their fingers brushing just briefly, and in that stillness the bond settled into something more than necessity. It was not romance yet, nor salvation, but the tender recognition of 2 people who had carried too much alone. Outside, the land lay hushed, the stars sharp in the black sky. Inside, for the first time since she had arrived, Clara did not feel entirely abandoned. And for Elias, the loneliness he had worn like armor cracked enough to let another presence in. It was a fragile peace, like the pause before a storm breaks, but it was real. The storm arrived on a night without thunder. Hoofbeats tore through the stillness, quick and sharp, drawing closer to Clara's cabin. She had been kneading dough when the sound struck her chest like a warning bell. The lamp flickered as she froze, her hands white with flour, and her eyes darted to the door. Elias had been mending a broken latch on his own shed, but he straightened at once, his instincts sharpened by years of listening for danger in the dark. 3 riders this time, not 2, their silhouettes cutting through the moonlight as they dismounted. Their boots hit the ground heavy, carrying arrogance and intent. The tallest of them hammered his fist against Clara's door, his voice rough with command. "Time's up, girl. You thought you could run." Clara's knees weakened beneath her, but she held the table edge and breathed through the terror that clawed at her chest. Elias stepped out of the shadows then, rifle in hand, his figure a barrier between the men and the cabin. "That's far enough," he said, his tone flat and measured. The riders laughed, their hands brush, the grips of their pistols. They recognized him, the solitary cowboy who had long kept his distance from the world, and they doubted he would risk himself for a woman he hardly knew. But Elias did not move. His stance was steady, and the silence around him carried the weight of decision. Clara opened the door behind him, her face pale but her jaw tight. She held the smaller rifle he had taught her to use, though her hands trembled around it. The sight made the men pause, their sneers faltering. One of them spat, muttering that she was not worth dying for, but the leader stepped forward, his eyes glinting cruel. He revealed what Clara had feared. The debt was not hers alone. She had fled after defending another seamstress who had been beaten near to death, and in standing against the foreman, she had cost him his grip on the women who worked under him. They wanted to make an example of her, not simply reclaim wages. The truth hit Elias like a blow. She was not only running from hardship but from vengeance, and the men would not stop until she was broken. He tightened his grip on the rifle, the weight of choice clear. He had promised himself long ago never to fight another man's war, never to shed blood again. Yet now, the woman behind him was no stranger, and if he walked away, she would be crushed beneath the same cruelty he had once sworn to escape. The standoff stretched, every breath taut. Then the leader drew his pistol, quick and sharp. Elias fired first. The crack split the night, echoing across the land. One rider fell, the others stumbling back in shock. Clara gasped, but held her ground, the rifle steady in her grasp. The remaining men cursed, retreating to their horses, shouting promises to return with more. Elias's chest heaved, the weight of the shot heavy in his bones. He had crossed the line he swore never to cross, risking death and solitude alike. Yet, when he turned, Clara was there. Her eyes filled not with fear, but with the fragile light of trust. The night hung heavy with the echo of gunfire. The dust from the rider's departure lingered in the air, clinging to the dry grass like smoke that refused to lift. Elias lowered the rifle, his arm stiff, his breath slow and uneven. For a moment he simply stood there, his figure carved against the pale wash of moonlight, as though uncertain whether he had saved anything at all or only invited worse. Clara remained by the doorway, clutching the smaller rifle tight against her chest. Her knuckles were white, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. She had seen men strike before, had watched cruelty play itself out in narrow alleys and crowded rooms. But what Elias had done was different. There had been no cruelty in it, only the raw choice of standing between her and destruction. Slowly, she lowered the weapon, her hands shaking as though the strength had drained all at once. Elias stepped forward, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. He looked at her without words, his gaze unreadable but steady. She swallowed, nodding faintly, and that single gesture carried more weight than a flood of speech. They both knew the men would return, and when they did, it would not be with 3 horses, but with many. The reprieve was fragile, fleeting, but it was theirs for this moment. Together, they buried the fallen rider at the edge of the field. Neither spoke as they dug, the sound of shovels cutting earth the only rhythm in the dark. The grave was shallow, unmarked, and when the last of the dirt was pushed over, Elias stood still, head bowed. He had carried too many bodies in his life, laid too many into the ground, and the weight of one more pressed hard against the scars he carried inside. Clara placed a small scrap of cloth at the mound, torn from her apron, a wordless sign that Eve and the cruel were not left entirely without witness. The cabin light burned low when they returned inside. Elias set his rifle by the door and sank into a chair, his shoulders heavy. Clara placed a vase, tin cup of water before him, her own hands still trembling but steady enough to pour. He accepted it, their eyes meeting only once before drifting apart again. Silence filled the room, yet it was not the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of 2 people who had seen death together and chosen, in that moment, not to abandon one another. Outside, The land remained wide and indifferent, the stars sharp against the endless dark. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of earth and gunpowder, a reminder that peace was never promised here. Yet Clara did not feel entirely hunted, and Elias no longer felt entirely alone. Whatever storm might come, they had crossed into something heavier than survival, something that would bind them until the end. The weeks that followed carried a stillness broken only by the sound of work. Clara baked and mended, her hands steadying into the rhythm of survival, while Elias repaired fences, sharpened tools, and kept his rifle close, though he prayed he would not need it again. The men who had threatened them did not return, though their shadows lingered in every creak of saddle leather, every dust cloud that rose along the road. Life became a waiting, yet in that waiting, something fragile and enduring began to take root. Clara's cabin no longer felt like a hollow shelter, but a home stitched slowly with care. Curtains swayed at the windows, the smell of bread often drifted out into the yard, and sometimes Elias sat across the table with a cup in his hands. They spoke little still, but their silence had shifted. No longer sharp with distance, it held the warmth of understanding. When she laughed once, quietly at her own clumsy spill of flour, Elias looked up with a startled softness, as though he had not heard such a sound in years. Seasons turned. Snow touched the land, then melted, leaving behind grass that grew tall and wild. To get at her they planted a small garden, rows of green breaking the earth, where a grave also lay, unmarked but remembered. The scrap of cloth Clara had left fluttered in the wind until it frayed to nothing, and she never replaced it. Some things were meant to fade, she believed, while others stayed in memory alone. Elias changed in ways only Clara could see. His steps were still heavy, his face still marked by weather and loss, but his eyes lingered longer now, softer when they met hers. Clara, once trembling at every knock or shadow, learned to lift her chin and meet the day without fear. They had not escaped pain, but they had built something small and enduring against it. One evening, as dusk painted the land in silver, they ate quietly at the table, the lantern between them burning low. Elias broke the bread, Clara poured the coffee, and the silence was whole, not empty. It felt like a life, however fragile. And as the wind carried through the open window, she realized that though survival had brought her here, it was not survival alone that would keep her. It was the choice they had both made, to no longer walk alone.